Now, the official Yes campaign for Labor's Voice is being launched at this very moment in Adelaide. This launch is being run by the From the Heart organisation during a week of promotion for Labor's plan, a week that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese kicked off on the weekend. But that plan does actually now seem in trouble. Joining me is Paul Kelly, Editor-at-Large of the Australian newspaper. Paul, always great to see you. You wrote a very, very powerful piece this week in the Australian about this. I think you believe that the Voice campaign right now, as it's going, without further changes, is dead.
What I've argued, Andrew, is that I think the Prime Minister is engaging in an act of deception and denial about the Voice. And the reason I say this is because the central point about the referendum is the model of the Voice, and that's what the government won't talk about. And the reality is that this model is a radical and far-reaching institutional change to the Australian Constitution and a very significant change to our system of government. That's what we ought to be discussing. That's what we ought to debate, and the government is not prepared to do that. What I've said is that if the government is not prepared to have a frank debate in good faith, based on integrity with the Australian people about what it's proposing, then the Voice should be voted down.
Paul, it's interesting. I mean, in the last week, we have had two of the people helping to design this Voice, both eminent legal experts, Professor Greg Craven, as you know, particularly saying, wait a minute, this Voice is too powerful. It will be able to stop Parliament from acting, potentially, particularly if High Court judges intervene and help give it that power. I had the impression that the Prime Minister was a little bit shaken this week and didn't say it's going to change anything, but I don't know that he feels as confident as he used to.
Well, I don't know if he's shaken or not, Andrew, but he ought to be shaken and he ought to reflect on the campaign so far. This campaign's gone for 6 months and I've reflected very much on what's happened over the past 6 months, and I understand there's a long way to go, and I understand that things are still unfolding. But Anthony Albanese, as Prime Minister, has got an obligation to speak frankly to the Australian people. Now, if you look at what he's proposed in terms of the constitutional amendment, he's talking about a new voice in the Constitution that can recommend to the Parliament and recommend to the entire executive government, the Cabinet, the Federal Executive Council, individual ministers, public servants, government institutions from the Reserve Bank onwards. Now, when you look at this proposal and assess it, I think the only conclusion is in terms of the workability of the model, this is a radical change to the way our governance works. It's going to change the relationship between the Parliament, the Executive. It's going to change the relationship between Indigenous peoples on the one hand and the Senate and the House of Representatives and the Executive Government on the other. We're not talking about this at all. And it seems to me the Prime Minister is trying to carry this debate on the vibe of the thing. I think that's unacceptable, and I think he's got to have a frank debate with the public about this proposal.
I think you're quite right. It's on feels, not facts, and there's a real risk, as Greg Craven now admits, that not only will the Voice then have the power to advise right down to that level you're talking about, hey, public servant, we're going to advise you, but there may be, it can be interpreted that the officials that they talk to, the politicians they talk to, have an obligation to listen before they act, and that will just gum up the whole works. But here, with this proposal, Paul, now in seeming trouble, you say it's gone for 6 months, the poll support is now dropping, and I think that will continue to happen. I cannot believe then Labor's tactics. if voters get too scared of the voice, it's going to be, think it's too big a change. They will vote no. But here comes Labor now saying it will start work on setting up, in the meantime, what's called a Makarrata Commission to negotiate a treaty as well, as if Aborigines already do live in a separate nation, and to document all the past evils done to Aborigines, like, let's, the whole victim culture, let's encourage that a bit. This timing of this further step seems to me so arrogant as well as self-defeating.
When I listen to the campaign for the voice and the statements made by the government, it seems to me they're extremely patronising of the Australian people. It's as though if you were a person of goodwill, you would really have no choice but to vote yes. Well, that won't work. The government has got to explain how this will work, how the voice will function, and what it means for our system of government. Now, the Prime Minister has committed in full to the Uluru Statement, which involves voice, treaty and truth-telling. And I think this is another quite important element. Seeing he's committed in full to the statement and the voice is only the first part, then we need to hear what the government's thinking is about the other two parts. If the government is going to start talking about that, I think it's a good thing. But again, I think this is an enormous issue. How will the treaty arrangement work? And clearly the voice will be involved in this. The other point to make about the voice, Andrew, is according to the constitutional amendment, the voice can give advice on virtually anything at all. This is open-ended and it's unqualified and it's virtually unlimited in terms of the subjects and the matter that the voice can make a recommendation on. It is not limited to issues and laws that exclusively or solely concern Indigenous peoples. If you look at the wording of the constitutional amendment, it applies to general laws, laws of general application, because those laws can also concern, obviously, Indigenous peoples.
That's from tax policies to education policies. I thought the Prime Minister again misled the Australian public today. I heard him say it's only going to affect legislation that would have a direct effect on Aborigines. That is not what the amendment is actually written says. That is deeply misleading. Paul Kelly, thank you so much indeed for your time. Terrific piece. I urge people to look it up on the Australian website.